In 5 explosive minutes, Jasmine Crockett shattered decades of denial in a live congressional hearing, facing Senator Tim Scott over America's darkest fault line: racially biased policing and the hidden codes protecting violent officers. Then came the shock. She exposed a classified FBI report, and the chamber froze. Scott was speechless. The media erupted, and Congress began to fracture. One woman, one file, one moment, could it topple an entire system built to silence her? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the marble dome of the Capitol, the hearing room was packed to the brink. Every seat was filled, lawmakers gripping pens, aides whispering nervously, and camera crews angling for the perfect shot. Then crack. The gavel slammed down like a gunshot. The chairman's voice rang out, slow and deliberate. This is the final hearing before the George Floyd Justice Act goes to vote. After today, there is no turning back. The room fell dead silent. All eyes shot to the red digital clock overhead, now counting down to 0. Exactly 4 hours, 19 minutes, and 45 seconds. No extensions, no delays. The tension hit like a thunderclap. The bill on the table was explosive. A sweeping police reform package banning chokeholds, ending qualified immunity, mandating body cameras, and creating national standards for police conduct. Opponents called it dangerous overreach. Supporters called it overdue justice. Either way, it would reshape law enforcement across America. And today, it stood trial. 2 figures sat opposite each other, center stage, framed by harsh overhead lights. On the left, Jasmine Crockett, Black Congresswoman, former public defender, fists clenched and spine straight. Her folder was thin. Her resolve wasn't. On the right, Senator Tim Scott, Republican, calm, collected, surrounded by thick binders and years of political armor. One demanded justice, one warned of chaos, and between them, the soul of the system. They weren't just here to speak. They were here to clash. News crawlers were already rolling, hashtags already queued. But inside that room, nothing moved. The cameras zoomed in tight on Jasmine's jaw, locked with tension, on Scott's eyes, scanning like a chess player. The chairman looked at both of them, raised the gavel once more, and struck it hard. Crack. The sound wasn't just ceremonial, it was the starting gun. That's when the real battle began. The final echo of the gavel still lingered in the chamber, when Tim Scott leaned forward, measured, unshaken, and already holding the floor like it was built for him. He adjusted his mic with the same precision he used to craft his words. No stutters, no nerves. Only the smooth cadence of a man who had said this before and planned to say it again. "Let's be honest," he began, his voice calm but heavy. 99% of police officers in this country are good men and women. They serve, they sacrifice, and they risk their lives for people who don't even thank them. The words were delivered like armor, polished, firm, and meant to deflect every coming blow. A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the Republican side of the aisle. One senator nodded. Another leaned back in his chair with a satisfied grin. Tim Scott let the moment breathe, then turned a page in his thick binder like a chess move. "What we have is a 1% problem, and you don't fix 1% with a wrecking ball." The phrase landed with a thud, blunt, intentional, designed for a soundbite. The chairman didn't move. Neither did the cameras. All were waiting to see what came next. "We need more training, not more punishment," Scott continued, his voice tightening slightly, just enough to add edge. "More funding, not less. You don't heal a wound by cutting deeper." His eyes briefly swept toward the cameras. He knew where this footage would go. "Let's give departments the tools they need, not strip them down until they're too afraid to respond." His jaw didn't move once the sentence ended. Just that flat stare, that stillness, like the whole room had been served a final verdict. "We protect our communities by building up the good, not tearing everything down for the sake of outrage." His closer was clean, no tremble, no apology, like he just sealed a chapter and dared anyone to reopen it. Then he leaned back in his chair with the poise of someone who believed the floor still belonged to him. No applause, no objections, just a wall of tension hanging over every head, like a courtroom waiting for the next witness. That's when Jasmine Crockett rose slowly, without a binder, without notes, without blinking. just a thin folder resting untouched on the table, and a presence that swallowed the room whole. She didn't speak yet. She didn't have to. Every inch of her silence was louder than Scott's speech. She stepped toward the microphone with calm that felt like a threat, her eyes locked forward, each step a silent dare. Her hand met the mic, a hiss of static, and then the room dropped into a silence so total, even the cameramen stopped breathing. Senator Scott says it's just 1%. She didn't shout. She didn't flinch. She just spoke the truth like it was a blade sharp, precise, and already buried halfway in. Her eyes swept the dais. 1 second passed. 2. She held them in the pause like she was pressing her hand on the nation's pulse. But if that 1% holds a gun, a badge, and the legal power to kill without consequence, then that 1% is a loaded weapon aimed at my community. There were no gasps, no shouts, just a shift in gravity. Some lawmakers sat up straighter, others looked down, but no one looked away. Jasmine's voice didn't rise. It simply sank deeper. If 1% can bury the innocent, then the other 99 become silent partners to a grave. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe. She just stood there, letting the silence collapse around her words like ash around flame. The silence Jasmine left behind didn't last long. Tim Scott reached for his binder like a man arming himself before walking back into fire. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He opened the binder with slow, practiced hands and adjusted the microphone with a precision that felt rehearsed. If you actually look at the data, he began, holding up a color-coded chart, you'll see that use of force incidents have dropped by over 16% nationwide in the past 5 years. His voice didn't carry anger, just numbers. Cold, controlled, clinical. And in most cases, the race of the suspect has no statistical impact on the outcome. He tapped the page twice, as if daring the truth to argue back. He continued, flipping to another tab. More charts, more bar graphs. The majority of departments show no patterns of racial bias. That's not opinion. That's federal data. His tone sharpened slightly, a lawyer tightening the cross-examination. We cannot legislate off feelings. We must legislate off facts. He looked directly across the table, his gaze hardening. And the facts say our officers are doing their jobs, not targeting communities based on skin color. His binder snapped shut. He leaned back, confident, certain. But for the first time, his shoulders held a trace of tension. Jasmine didn't look impressed. She didn't even blink. Instead, she reached to her right, took a small remote in hand, and pressed a single button. The giant monitor behind her flickered to life. No sound, just a single video. A black man face down on concrete, a white officer's knee buried into his neck. A digital timer appeared in the bottom right corner. Iru, wow, Zorro, Irwell 1. The clip didn't need narration. It had already spoken to the world once. Now it would speak again in this room, under oath. She stayed seated, didn't say a word, just let the video play. The man struggled. The officer didn't move. 2 minutes, 4, 6. The stillness in the chamber turned to dread. A few aides turned away. One senator adjusted his glasses, suddenly uncomfortable. Even Scott's eyes dropped from the screen for just a moment. No sound, no voiceover. Just a man dying slowly while the timer ticked past 8 minutes and 14 seconds. Jasmine rose. No dramatic flourish, no raised voice. Just a calm, lethal clarity as she walked toward the screen. She turned to the committee, eyes locked, voice low but sharp enough to cut through marble. This case, your office never issued a statement, not a word. No press release, no hearing, nothing. The video paused, final frame frozen in silence. The image of a life crushed under silence. The reaction came in ripples, sharp, rising. A reporter dropped her pen. One lawmaker whispered something to another. The chairman banged the gavel once, no one listened. He banged it again harder. Order! Order in the chamber! But the room was already unmoored. Facts couldn't breathe here. Only memory. Only witness. Then Jasmine turned back. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't ask permission. It just declared. In a place where people can't breathe, logic doesn't have air either. The words didn't echo, they landed. And in that instant, No statistic, no binder, no data set could stand between her and the truth hanging in the room like smoke. No one moved, no one dared. The room was still staring at the frozen frame on the screen when Jasmine shifted the weight of the conversation from headlines to something far more personal. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She opened the slim folder in front of her like it held something sacred and toxic. Her hand moved slowly, carefully, as she pulled out a photo and held it up to the room. "That's my uncle." The image was old, faded around the corners. A man in a hospital bed, neck braced, one eye swollen shut. No name tag, just bruises and silence. She stepped forward, holding the photo higher, making sure everyone saw it. Her voice didn't tremble. It dropped lower, heavier. He was beaten by 2 officers after asking them a simple question: "What did I do wrong?" Her thumb tapped the edge of the photo once, like punctuation. He never got an answer, just a broken spine, a shattered shoulder, and a wheelchair that he never stood up from again. You could almost hear someone shift in their seat, but no one spoke. She placed the photo face up on the table, letting it stare back at the institution that broke him. Then came the second sheet, thicker, stained, and worn like it had passed too many in different hands. A formal complaint. Sealed. Signed. Ignored. She didn't wave it. She pressed it flat, like she was pinning it to the conscience of the nation. "This is the complaint we filed." Her fingers tapped it once, twice, 3 times, each tap like a quiet punch. 7 years, 7. The words were bullets measured, spaced, and deadly. No response, no indictment, no internal review, nothing. Her eyes scanned the dais. No one interrupted. No one dared. He didn't get justice. He didn't even get acknowledged. The file sat there like a corpse no one wanted to claim. 7 years of silence, 7 years of bureaucracy, 7 years of no air. She leaned forward slightly, not in anger, but in indictment. Her voice narrowed to a whisper that hit harder than any shout. He wasn't a suspect. He wasn't violent. He was walking home from church. They broke him anyway. 1 line, no theatrics, just truth. She tapped the file again once. Final. And then they disappeared his name like it was paperwork. The silence Jasmine left behind wasn't empty, it was heavy. And Tim Scott, for the first time that day, looked like a man debating whether to speak from policy or from pain. He stared down at the table, motionless. The binder in front of him sat untouched. His fingers didn't move. His voice didn't come immediately. But something had changed in his posture. No longer the senator with facts and charts, now just a son remembering the night he nearly lost everything. When he finally spoke, the words didn't come out sharp. They came out like something pulled from a place he rarely let anyone see. "When I was 15, my mother was working a double shift. She got home late, real late." He lifted his head slowly, eyes glassy but locked forward. "There was a man waiting in the stairwell of our apartment building. He had a knife. He grabbed her from behind." The room didn't move. No phones buzzed. No aides whispered. It was just him and the memory, unfolding piece by piece. She screamed. He dragged her back down the stairs. He paused just for a second, like the image still lived behind his eyes, then continued. "But someone heard her, called the police." His voice tightened, not out of control, but held back like a dam threatening to break. "They came fast, tackled him right there in the lobby. If they had been 5 minutes later..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The unsaid part, the blood, the funeral, the life rewritten was louder than any word he could have chosen. "My mother's alive because of those officers. I owe them my life." His hands curled into fists around the edge of the table. Not in anger, in memory. For a moment, the hearing room became something else. Not a battleground, not a political theater, but a quiet space where 2 truths sat across from each other, refusing to cancel one another out. Jasmine, whose uncle never walked again. Tim, whose mother still breathed because someone in uniform showed up in time. 2 stories, 2 systems. One justice system that chose who to protect and who to forget. The cameras shifted focus tighter now. Jasmine's lower lip trembled, eyes shining. but she didn't look away. Tim's face had hardened, but his shoulders sank under the weight of what he had just relived. Neither one interrupted the other's grief. Because in that moment, the debate wasn't about the system's existence, it was about its consistency. And that, more than any data point or soundbite, was the war neither of them had signed up to fight, but both were forced to carry. The room had just barely exhaled when a voice from the far end sliced through the tension like a knife, reckless, sharp, and begging for a reaction. He didn't wait for permission. A congressman from the far right wing leaned forward, lips curled in disdain, voice loud enough to cut past microphones and decorum alike. "If you're not happy with the police," he snapped, "you're free to move somewhere else." The words hung there like a slap, not just at Jasmine, but at every family name written in blood and silence. There was no debate in his tone, only dismissal, like her story wasn't worth the paper it was filed on. The insult wasn't shouted, but it detonated. A slow gas moved through the chamber, subtle but sharp, like oxygen being pulled out of the room. One senator shifted uncomfortably. A staffer looked up from her notepad, stunned. Tim Scott didn't react. Not yet. All eyes had turned to Jasmine because they knew what was coming, and they knew it wouldn't be quiet. She stood. No hesitation. No dramatic pause. She stood like a verdict rising. Then crack. Her palm hit the desk with a thunderous slap that bounced off the walls. Chairs rattled. Papers jumped. And her voice, low but volcanic, surged forward. "I was born here. I am not a guest." She didn't yell. She declared. The words hit like a gavel of their own, final, uncompromising, and aimed straight at the rot beneath the comment. The room didn't move. No one dared. Her eyes were locked like twin blades on the congressman who'd spoken. And though he looked away, it was too late. The damage was done. The truth had been set on fire. Tim Scott, still seated, released a slow, audible breath, then spoke gently, his words tired and deliberate. "Don't let emotion kill reason." He wasn't provoking her. He was trying to keep the room from tipping into chaos. But even as the words left his mouth, he seemed to know they wouldn't land. Jasmine didn't blink, didn't shift. Her hands stayed planted on the desk, shoulders forward, as if bracing the entire structure of the hearing with nothing but her will. Her voice dropped, not in weakness, but in precision. "I saw blood before I saw reason." 5 words, and every one of them hit like the crack of a whip. There was no metaphor, no theory, just lived experience poured into a sentence so sharp it sliced through the air. The impact was instant. One aide froze mid-step. A reporter lowered his phone. And for the 3rd time that day, the chairman's gavel slammed down. "Order! Order in the chamber!" He struck again, louder, faster, desperate to regain control. But the chamber had shifted. The ground had moved. Jasmine wasn't just answering a comment, she was striking at the very core of who gets to belong, who gets to speak, and who gets told to move somewhere else when their story makes the powerful uncomfortable. The gavel kept pounding, but it couldn't drown the silence that followed her words. A silence not of peace, but of impact. One that left the room holding its breath, because everyone knew something had just cracked and it wasn't her. The echo of Jasmine's final sentence still lingered in the air like smoke when she reached for the folder thinner than Tim Scott's, but heavier than anything he'd brought. Jasmine didn't look at anyone as she opened the file. Her fingers moved with the precision of someone who'd waited too long to be heard and was now done asking. She pulled out a single sheet of paper and held it in the air, not for spectacle, but for the record. "This is a leaked internal report from the FBI," she said, her voice low, tight, deadly focused. "It shows that 27% of police departments have unofficial policies in place, policies that intentionally ignore or suppress cases of racially motivated excessive force." Her eyes scanned the committee bench like she was searching for anyone willing to say that number out loud. The monitor behind her lit up. A government document, beige and cold, filled the screen. The formatting was familiar. Line numbers, agency headers, procedural codes. But beneath that bureaucratic surface was something far uglier. Entire lines blacked out, redacted. Paragraphs with black bars like slashes across a confession. But enough survived to make its meaning unmistakable. Phrases like internal discretion advised, non-priority unless reviewed by department lead, and media presence may dictate administrative urgency. No one in the room spoke. The silence was no longer respectful, it was stunned. Jasmine stepped closer to the screen and tapped it once, like a prosecutor pressing a fingerprint into evidence. This language wasn't meant for the public. That's why it's been buried. But it still exists, and it's not a fluke. Her tone sharpened. This wasn't one officer. This wasn't one department. This was policy. Tim Scott finally stirred. He leaned in, elbow on the desk, brow creased but steady. He spoke calmly, but his words came like a controlled burn. That's not evidence of a system. That's anecdotal. Isolated behavior, exceptions, not rules. His voice hardened slightly at the end. We don't burn down the house because of a broken pipe. He closed his binder again. For a moment, it felt like he was taking back control. But Jasmine was already prepared. This isn't one pipe, she replied, her voice flat, unshaken. It's a blueprint. She pressed another button on her remote. The screen changed, now split into 5 columns. New York, Texas, Ohio, Louisiana, Arizona. Each column displayed an internal memo from a different department. And then came the twist. Entire paragraphs were identical. Same sentences, same structure, same buried commands. Lines were highlighted in red. Boxes drawn around key phrases. Phrases like de-escalate media not behavior or delay incident documentation until narrative is stabilized. Jasmine didn't explain them. She didn't need to. The replication was the indictment. This line here, officers are advised to de-escalate media, not behavior, appears in 5 states. Word for word. She didn't turn from the screen when she said it. She wanted it to hang in front of their eyes and stay there. The committee bench shifted. A few lawmakers whispered behind folders. One scribbled something furiously on a legal pad. Another just stared at the screen like it had stopped his breath. Across the aisle, a staffer grabbed her phone with trembling fingers. She wasn't tweeting. She was taking a picture. Because this moment wasn't just rhetoric, it was record. And record couldn't be deleted. Tim Scott said nothing. He didn't blink. But the flicker in his eyes said more than he meant to reveal. Not defeat, not agreement, just recognition. That this wasn't a debate anymore. It was exposure. The cameras zoomed in, slowly, deliberately, first on the documents, then on Jasmine's hand still pointing at the screen, then on the faces of the senators, some shifting, some stone still, all processing the same thing. The problem wasn't theoretical anymore. It had a signature. It had coordinates. It had 5 states and counting. The hearing room, once rigid and procedural, now felt like it might explode under its own weight. The document remained on screen, frozen, damning. Jasmine didn't sit. She didn't smile. She just stood there calm, unblinking, as if waiting for someone to finally say what she didn't have to. Because the silence in that moment was no longer ignorance. It was complicity. Inside the hearing room, the screen still glowed with the exposed documents. But outside those walls, the country was already catching fire. The moment Jasmine finished pointing to the 5th document, a shift rippled not just across the chamber, but through every screen, phone, and satellite feed tuned in. Cable news producers scrambled in their control rooms, yelling for new graphics. Editors clipped her words and overlaid them on slow-motion footage of the redacted FBI files. Talk shows canceled their next segments. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a national broadcast with no script. On the East Lawn, where the press tent sat baking under the August sun, reporters who had been half asleep in folding chairs suddenly bolted upright. Phones lit up. Heads turned. One junior producer from a local affiliate ran full speed toward the rotunda, screaming to her cameraman, "They just dropped federal documents, 5 states." Veteran reporters, even the jaded ones, leaned into their mics. Something was happening that couldn't be explained in sound bites. Back in the Capitol corridors, the ripple turned into a wave. Senators and representatives not even attending the hearing began crowding outside the doors. Aides pressed tablets to their bosses' chests. Words like FBI leak, policy memo, copy-paste cover-up spread like wildfire. One senator from the Midwest muttered under his breath as he rewatched the footage on loop, That can't be real. That cannot be real. But it was, and no one could unsee it. 3 lawmakers who had entered the day undecided now stood by the marble columns just outside the hearing chamber. Cameras found them instantly. The reporters closed in like wolves sensing weakness. Flashes exploded as questions flew. Are you still planning to vote against the bill? Have you seen the second slide? Are you still confident this isn't systemic? One of the senators, a centrist Democrat, shook his head. He looked dazed, like he'd walked into a courtroom and left covered in blood. We're reviewing everything, he said quietly. We're reconsidering our position. Another lawmaker spoke more plainly, his voice tight. I didn't come here today expecting to see government templates hiding police violence across multiple states. That changes things. Even as he spoke, his aide reached out and lowered his mic slightly too late. The clip had already gone out. The sentence was already in rotation. And by the time he returned inside, it was playing on national television in 3 different time zones. Inside the chamber, the gavel kept slamming. Once, twice, again. The chairman shouted for order, his voice rising above the din. But the sound no longer controlled the room. It blended with the voices now bleeding in through the chamber doors, news anchors broadcasting live just a few feet away, their urgency vibrating through the walls. The chairman looked up at the ceiling as if he could hear the broadcast thundering above them. Order! I will have order! But the hearing had already slipped past the threshold of order. Jasmine remained still, her hand no longer pointing, her body calm, but her eyes stayed locked on the chaos building around her. She wasn't reacting to it. She had anticipated it. This wasn't a spontaneous storm. It was the result of months, maybe years, of gathering what no one wanted to name. And now that it was out, the world was no longer watching a hearing. It was watching a reckoning. Reporters paced frantically just outside the viewing gallery. You could see them through the frosted glass phones to their ears, eyes wide, mouths moving fast. One assistant producer mouthed to her cameraman behind the glass, "We need her clip again. The sentence about the blueprint." Another intern whispered, "The copy-paste line. That's the one. That's going viral." A third stood shaking, trying to upload footage through a jammed hotspot because every media device within 2 blocks was choked from the data traffic flooding in. The soundscape inside the room began to distort. The gavel's echo became background noise. Whispers among senators turned into full-on hallway meetings. Aides crossed the floor more than once, delivering notes not on procedure, but on media fallout. Jasmine stood firm. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence screamed louder than any soundbite being sliced up outside. At one point, the chairman paused. His hand hovered above the gavel. He looked around the room, breathing heavily. Across from him, a senior Republican rubbed his temples, not from fatigue but calculation. Everything was being reshuffled. Allegiances, narratives, risks. He didn't look at Jasmine, but he no longer looked at Tim Scott either, because something far bigger than their debate had just taken center stage. The hearing had collided with the world outside, and the collision was visible in every frame of every broadcast now playing live across the country. 2 rhythms battled in the air, the hammering of the gavel, the chaos of a media storm just inches away. They bled into each other until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. And that's when it became clear. This wasn't a hearing anymore. It was a countdown. Just when it felt like the hearing couldn't push any deeper, when truth had already rattled the walls, and silence had done more than shouting the back door open. And everything changed again. It wasn't loud. There was no announcement, just the faint click of a side door, far from the podium, where most in the room wouldn't even think to look. Heads turned as 2 plainclothes officers stepped in, one on each side of a man who didn't belong to any side, neither political nor scripted. He didn't walk like a politician. He didn't look like one either. White, mid-50s, close-cropped hair, clean-shaven face marked by stress lines, and a nervous energy that clung to him like static. He wore a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled up, sweat visible at the collar. His hands trembled. His steps were unsure, but he walked anyway. A few people murmured. Someone near the back whispered, "Who is that?" Another staffer flipped through the schedule and mouthed silently, "No witness left." But then the chairman received a folded document handed off by a marshal. He unfolded it slowly, brows rising as he read. A microphone clicked on before he even looked up. Chair recognizes a late entry witness under protective status, the chairman announced. His voice was clear, solemn. Motion previously approved. Whistleblower designation. Name sealed from the public record. Gasps, actual gasps. People sat up straighter. Even senators who had barely moved all day shifted in their seats. Tim Scott looked across the room, surprised. Jasmine didn't move, her eyes locked onto the man, as if sensing something was about to be revealed that no one had prepared for. He stepped forward, one foot in front of the other, like every inch cost him a memory. No introduction, no opening statement. He just walked to the center microphone and took a long breath, his knuckles white as he gripped the podium. The silence in the room became something sacred. Then he spoke. His voice cracked on the first word. I was taught that black skin was a threat. That was it. That one line stopped time. Not metaphor, not political positioning, a confession. A man speaking not from a prepared statement, but from a lifetime that he had just decided to betray for the first time. His chest rose sharply as he tried to continue. His voice shook. His lips quivered, but he didn't stop. I'm a former officer, 22 years. I trained rookies. I ran tactical briefings. I wore the badge, and I followed orders. He paused, almost choking on the next sentence. And those orders taught me that people who look like her, he pointed at Jasmine with a trembling hand, were dangerous by default. He stopped there, unable to go on. His eyes watered. His mouth opened, then closed. His breath hitched like someone was squeezing the air out of him. I was told that if they run, they're guilty. If they speak up, they're aggressive. If they reach for anything, even ID, it might be a weapon. We were told not to wait, not to ask, just react, just survive. He gritted his teeth. But it wasn't about surviving. It was about conditioning. It was about fear as policy, fear as muscle memory, fear as law. Jasmine's eyes began to blur, the light from the overhead fluorescence bouncing off her tears. She didn't wipe them away. She just stood still, her face tight, her chest rising slow, like someone holding in a scream. This wasn't outrage. It was recognition. The man wiped his face with his sleeve. I passed it down. I passed it to the next officer and the one after him. I didn't question it. I reinforced it. His voice broke again. And every time I did, someone else paid the price for my silence. He looked down at the podium, like he couldn't bear to look Jasmine in the eye anymore. I left the force 2 years ago. It didn't feel right anymore. Not after watching that video, not after hearing my own voice echo in my head. I filed the complaint. Internal Affairs buried it. I tried again. They warned me, so I went quiet. He paused, then added almost in a whisper, 2 months ago, I filed for whistleblower protection. That was the moment the chamber shifted again. Jasmine turned her eyes toward him fully. No words, no judgment. Just a woman seeing someone finally choose truth after years of benefiting from its absence. And across the room, Tim Scott dropped his head. Not in disagreement, not in shame, but in silent acknowledgement. Because the one thing he had insisted was anecdotal was now standing before him in human form, breaking apart at the seams. Then something extraordinary happened. One by one, the senators stood. No cue, no instruction, just instinct. A quiet recognition that they were no longer witnesses to a debate, but to a reckoning. The aides rose next, then the observers. No applause, no commentary. Just a stillness so thick it hummed. 10 full seconds passed. No one spoke. No one dared. The chairman didn't reach for the gavel. The cameras didn't zoom. The journalists didn't even type. The only sound was breath. Human breath. Fast, uneven, choked with everything no one knew how to say. And for the first time all day, there was no need for microphones. Because truth didn't need a speaker. It had just walked into the room shaking, breaking, and finally speaking. The room had just been cracked open by confession, by truth, by the kind of raw clarity that could silence centuries of noise. What came next wasn't celebration, it was reckoning. And for Tim Scott, it started with a decision that would forever change how history remembered this room. Tim Scott didn't speak at first. He stared at the floor, elbows locked against the desk, fingers clenched into a white-knuckled prayer. His shoulders didn't move. His lips didn't twitch. But everything else about him had shifted. The usual weight he carried, part legacy, part loyalty, was now outmatched by the one thing he couldn't debate: the truth he'd just witnessed. When he finally lifted his eyes, they weren't filled with fire. They were filled with defeat. Not political defeat, but something more human. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She didn't press. She didn't taunt. She just waited. She knew what this moment was. Not a power grab, not a victory dance. This was the breath between collapse and courage. The kind of silence where something either breaks or rebuilds. Cameras leaned in. Staffers froze. No one dared interrupt. Tim Scott reached for the manila folder in front of him. He didn't open it. He pushed it aside. Everything inside had been written before the hearing, before the confession, before the silence that now wrapped the room like a verdict no one expected. Instead, he took out a blank legal pad, clicked his pen twice, and spoke. "I'll accept the terms." It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it hit harder than any gavel. The tension snapped like a dry branch. A murmur rushed through the chamber like wind through tall grass. Some gasped, others stared. But Jasmine, she blinked once, just once. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She just locked eyes with him and waited. "Body cameras mandatory," he said firmly, scribbling the words in sharp, deliberate strokes. "No exceptions. No unfunded mandates. If you wear a badge, you wear a lens." He didn't look up. "And chokeholds? Banned, explicitly. In federal code. No loopholes. No departmental discretion." Reporters in the back fumbled for their phones. Aides leaned over, whispering in disbelief. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. This was a surrender of a different kind, one stitched together not by politics, but by something deeper, something fragile, something rare. Tim's voice didn't waver, but his posture softened. "There will be independent oversight commissions at the state level," he said, glancing briefly at the panel. "They will have full transparency, access, and subpoena power." "Sure," he paused. "We'll find the money." You could almost hear the moment history changed course, not because two sides agreed, but because one side let go of its fear. Tim Scott exhaled, set the pen down, and for the first time in the hearing, looked relieved. He had finally stopped defending a system that had defended itself for too long. Jasmine leaned forward now, slowly, like every word mattered. Because it did. "We'll keep your community policing proposal in," she said. Her voice wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was tempered. Earned. "It works in some places. It builds local trust. It needs oversight, but it stays." Her tone cut through the noise without needing to rise. She knew the weight of what she was offering. She wasn't throwing him a bone. She was holding the door open. A narrow door, but real. "It's not perfect," she added, her eyes never leaving his. "But it's something." That's when something strange happened. Tim Scott nodded, not once, not subtly, but with full clarity. A real nod. The kind that doesn't just agree, but yields. And then he reached back for the pen, adding Jasmine's words onto the same page. Behind them, a staffer was already redlining a new draft. Another aide was updating a press release. Words like bipartisan compromise, landmark pivot, and cross-aisle cooperation filled the subject lines of 100 unreleased tweets. But inside the room, no one moved fast, because they all knew this wasn't a media win. This was a wound being stitched thread by thread. On the large screen behind the witness table, the new terms flashed in real time. Mandatory body cameras, federal ban on chokeholds, independent state oversight commissions, preservation of community-based policing initiatives. Each bullet point landed like a bell toll. Simple, stark, final. Somewhere in the gallery, a mother who had lost her son to a traffic stop gone wrong closed her eyes and whispered, "Finally." A few seats down, a police sergeant held his breath. He'd trained officers for 20 years. He'd watched good ones fall. And now finally he saw something that could actually change what the badge meant. Jasmine leaned back slightly, but her hand stayed on the table. She didn't exhale. Not yet. She knew this wasn't done. It was written, yes, but not signed, not voted, not passed. But it was born, and sometimes that's the loudest thing a room can hear. "I'm not asking for trust," Jasmine finally said, her voice steady. "I'm asking for accountability. The law should not be a promise, it should be a boundary." She turned to the panel. "This bill doesn't fix everything, but it stops the bleeding." Tim Scott didn't respond. He didn't need to. The bill now bore both their fingerprints. His signature would come, but his silence already spoke volumes. A journalist from the Washington Post leaned to their editor and whispered, "This isn't about parties anymore. This is about pressure meeting its match." And Jasmine? She didn't soak in the glory. She looked to the ceiling, not to pray, not to pose, but because sometimes that's where you stare when your fight finally makes a crack in the wall. The compromise was on the table, fragile as glass, and yet the weight of the entire nation rested on it. The chamber of the House was so quiet that even the faint creak of a chair sounded like thunder rolling through marble walls. The moment had arrived, the one everyone had dreaded, the one everyone had secretly been waiting for. The speaker called for the vote, and a stillness unlike anything before descended. Lawmakers who had spent hours posturing, arguing, and throwing words like weapons now sat stiff and pale, their voices pressed down into their chests, their hands gripping the edges of their desks as if bracing for impact. This was not routine procedure anymore. This was history in the making, the kind of moment that every camera, every microphone, every eye in America locked onto. The roll call began, steady and merciless, one name after another pronounced by the clerk, one voice after another answering in tones that ranged from defiant to resigned. Some voices cracked, betraying nerves. Others rang with stubborn certainty. Each answer was a coin tossed into the air, and the tally board lit up slowly, agonizingly, like the steady tick of a doomsday clock. Jasmine Crockett stood, refusing to sit. She folded her arms tightly, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the numbers climbing on the board. It was not suspense. She felt it was a pressure so immense that her very body seemed to brace against it. She knew too well that this was not about perfection. This was about survival, about breaking through the wall just enough to let in a shaft of light. The board climbed closer to the threshold. Every new aye felt like oxygen returning, every no like a punch to the lungs. The chamber, already tense, began to thrum with the energy of something collapsing and being built at the same time. Whispers darted like shadows along the aisles. Aides scribbled furiously on pads. The press gallery leaned forward as if by instinct, their fingers poised above keyboards ready to write the headline that would follow the vote for decades. And yet, amid the chaos, there was still silence. It was the silence of suspense, of destiny balanced on the edge of a knife. The vote hovered dangerously close to the line, a single step away from failure, a single step away from history. Then came a moment of pause, a single undecided lawmaker shifting in his seat. He looked across the chamber, directly into Jasmine's eyes. Their gaze locked, one carrying the weight of every family she had sworn to fight for, the other carrying the burden of fear, calculation, and the knowledge that his decision would follow him forever. The pause stretched long enough to break nerves, and then came the nod, small but unshakable. His voice followed with an aye. That was the push. That was the drop of water that made the glass overflow. The final votes trickled in, one hesitant, one firm, one delayed until the last possible moment. The tally board lit with the total, a number so close to the line that it seemed unreal, almost fragile, as though it could vanish if anyone breathed too hard. And then the silence exploded, not with cheers, not with applause, but with the sound of disbelief, the kind of sound that comes when something impossible finally happens. The bill had passed, just barely, but it had passed. The speaker's voice announced the outcome, his words heavy and deliberate, and the chamber broke into gasps, murmurs, and a storm of reactions that ranged from relief to stunned resignation. The reporters in the gallery were already typing like mad. their headlines racing each other across digital wires. A historic day on Capitol Hill. For years, the George Floyd Justice Act had been a battlefield of ideology, resistance, and bitter wounds, and now it stood on the edge of becoming law. The board glowed with the final tally, and it was as if the room itself couldn't believe what it was seeing. Jasmine stepped forward. She did not rush. She did not throw her arms into the air. She did not smile. She walked as if the floor beneath her feet had become sacred ground, each step deliberate, each breath measured. When she reached the podium, the chamber went still again. No one interrupted, no one moved. She looked across the room at everyone, the allies who had stood with her, the enemies who had fought her, the ones who had wavered, and the ones who had stayed silent. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut sharper than steel. Laws can change hands, but only hearts change habits. The words landed like a hammer against glass, shattering whatever fragile comfort the chamber had allowed itself. Some lawmakers looked down at their desks, unable to meet her gaze. Others sat frozen, as if those words had pierced through the armor they had carried into the room. For Jasmine, it wasn't a victory speech. It wasn't triumph. It was a reminder, a warning, a truth that the vote could not wash away. She let the silence after her words stretch long enough for it to hurt, long enough for it to embed itself into memory. Then she stepped back. Nothing more. Across the room, Tim Scott finally moved. He had not cheered, had not spoken, had not betrayed the storm inside him. Now, slowly, he rose. His face carried no expression of triumph or loss, no smugness, no rage. It carried only the heaviness of a man who had stepped into history unwillingly and knew he would never walk out the same. He gathered his papers quietly, stacked them with deliberate care, and walked out. His steps were heavy, deliberate, unhurried. His eyes stayed low, avoiding cameras, avoiding colleagues, avoiding even Jasmine. He left the chamber like a man slipping into exile. No one called after him. No one stopped him. His silence said more than any speech ever could. And then, with Scott gone and Jasmine's words still reverberating, the speaker raised the gavel for the last time. 3 sharp strikes cracked against the wood, each one echoing like gunfire across the marble chamber. The sound reverberated into the bones of everyone present, a sound that would haunt them long after the cameras shut off. The vote was done, the session closed, the debate for now finished. But no one truly felt closure. The chamber did not erupt into applause. It did not swell with joy. Instead, it sat in the strange quiet of aftermath. Some lawmakers stared blankly ahead, their faces masks of shock. Others exchanged glances of disbelief. A few bowed their heads, overwhelmed by the gravity of what had just happened. And Jasmine? She stood still, eyes fixed on the chamber, absorbing every flicker of human reaction. She wasn't celebrating. She was watching, memorizing, engraving into herself the look of a room that had finally bent, even if it had not yet broken. Outside, the press was already preparing for chaos. Cameras clicked, microphones gathered, pundits rehearsed lines about compromise and courage. But inside, the silence was the real headline. The silence carried Jasmine's words, carried the tension of Scott's retreat, carried the gavel's final echo. And though the vote had ended, though the bill had passed, everyone in that chamber knew the truth. This was no ending. It was not the conclusion of the story. It was a pause, a breath, a crack in the wall that still stood tall. And so the chamber lingered in that silence. A silence filled not with satisfaction, but with weight. The law had been changed. The vote had been won. The press would call it historic, and they would not be wrong. But Jasmine's warning lingered. Laws can change hands, but only hearts change habits. That was the work ahead. That was the battle that no tally board could measure. And as the final gavel echo faded, the air inside the chamber carried only one truth. This ending was not an end at all. It was the beginning of a much harder fight. The gavel's echo was gone, but what lingered was not silence. It was a lesson, raw and unflinching, a truth too sharp to hide in paper and ink. The chamber was still buzzing with the aftershock of the vote, but beneath the chaos of reporters and aides, something heavier pressed into the air. It was not victory. It was not defeat. It was recognition that the law might have changed, but the deeper battle had only been revealed. The moment forced every person in that room to confront the same human truth. Justice is not made in marble halls. It is tested in the streets, in the neighborhoods, in the fleeting seconds when a life hangs in the balance. A law can be signed in ink, but a habit lives in the reflex of a hand, in the prejudice behind a glance, in the fear that tightens before thought has even formed. That was the battlefield untouched by the tally board, and everyone knew it. Jasmine's words cut through the tension like a blade. Laws can change hands, but only hearts change habits. It was not just rhetoric. It was a verdict on the moment itself, a warning against believing too quickly that paper could rewrite people. In her voice, the lesson rang. A law can outlaw a chokehold, but it cannot outlaw the thought that sparked it. A law can mandate cameras, but it cannot force a man to see the person in front of him as fully human. That kind of change does not come with votes, it comes with the breaking and remaking of hearts. And hearts, unlike bills, cannot be pushed through by slim margins. They must be confronted, wrestled with, and transformed in silence and struggle. The humanitarian lesson of the day rose from the cracks between stories told in the chamber. On one side, Jasmine had carried the pain of her uncle, beaten into disability for daring to ask a question, carrying scars no policy could erase. On the other, Tim Scott had carried the memory of his mother, saved by officers who showed up when she was in danger. Two truths, both raw, both real, colliding in one space. The law had chosen to acknowledge both in its compromise, but the deeper truth was this: justice is not uniform. For some, it has been a shield. For others, a weapon. And until the shield and the weapon cease to divide along the same lines of race, geography, and class, the habit of injustice will survive whatever law is written against it. The chamber's silence after her words was not emptiness, it was weight. It pressed down on the shoulders of every lawmaker who knew that they had just witnessed something larger than politics. It pressed into the faces of aides who realized their notes and memos were suddenly irrelevant compared to the magnitude of what had been said. It pressed into the cameras that had caught every syllable, ready to carry it out into living rooms, classrooms, and police precincts across the nation. The lesson was alive, too alive to remain in the chamber, and yet, even with the power of her words, the danger of self-deception loomed. Laws make people feel safe. They let institutions declare progress. But the deeper lesson insisted that safety was not measured by statutes passed, but by breaths uninterrupted, by lives that went home instead of to morgues, by communities that could trust instead of fear. Laws can change hands, but only hearts change habits. It was a reminder that habits kill faster than legislation heals, that reflexes built over decades cannot be dismantled in a single vote. The vote was necessary, it was vital, but it was not enough. Every person who heard her knew that the weight of the lesson would not fall on Congress alone. It would fall on the rookie cop in his first patrol car, on the veteran officer who had carried unexamined biases for 30 years, on the judges who signed off on complaints, on the neighbors who chose when to call the police and when to stay silent. It would fall on children watching their parents watch the news, on citizens deciding whether to believe the law had really changed anything at all. The true battlefield was not marble. It was human flesh, human fear, human choice. Jasmine did not speak again after those words because she didn't need to. Her silence said what her sentence had carved into the air. This was not a triumphal end. This was a dangerous beginning. The humanitarian lesson of the moment was that justice is always two-faced. On one side, the paper victory of law. On the other, the deeper war for hearts that can make or unmake the law's meaning. To celebrate too soon would be to forget that habits outlive headlines, and habits are what kill. Tim Scott's departure only sharpened that lesson. His silence, his bowed head, his heavy steps out of the chamber, all of it underscored the truth that laws may shape institutions, but they do not untangle the contradictions living inside a single man. He had chosen to vote yes, to step across a line, but his face made clear that compromise is not the same as conviction. He walked away carrying the contradiction of his own story, a man both protected by the system and forced to acknowledge its cruelty. His silence was itself a lesson. The law may shift, but the heart takes longer. And when the gavel struck its final blows, sealing the session, its echo carried the full weight of that duality. It was the sound of history, yes, but also the sound of unfinished business. The law had been passed, the ink would soon dry, but Jasmine's warning still lingered in the air, filling the cracks between applause and silence. A chamber can vote, a bill can pass, but unless the habits of power change, justice will remain fragile, temporary, conditional. That was the humanitarian lesson carved into the marrow of the day, that systems can be bent by law, but only souls can be reshaped by truth. That until the heart bends toward humanity, no statute will ever be enough. And that was why her words refused to fade, because they were not just words. They were the verdict on the moment, on the nation, on everyone who would ever look back and ask not just what law was passed, but whether it mattered. The lesson was branded into the air like a scar, but lessons alone do not move nations. A law can pass, a chamber can cheer, but without action, without a fire that leaps beyond these marble walls, the truth dies on paper. What came next was no longer a debate, it was a call, a demand, a summons hurled at every conscience watching. Jasmine stood at the podium, shoulders squared, her breath heavy but steady, her face illuminated under the harsh white lights. The chamber was buzzing still with fragments of whispers, the sound of pens scratching, the faint clicks of reporters filing words into history. But her voice cut through all of it like a knife. She didn't shout. She didn't beg. She commanded the silence back into the room with nothing more than the gravity of her tone. This vote is not the finish line. It is the starting gun. The words hit like a gunshot in a canyon, sharp and irreversible, ricocheting from wall to wall. Every head turned back toward her, every eye locked in. She leaned forward slightly, her palms pressing into the wood of the podium, and her gaze shifted past the lawmakers, past the cameras, as though she could see through the lens into living rooms across the nation. If we leave change in the hands of lawmakers alone, nothing will shift. This fight belongs to the people every march, every voice, every refusal to be silent. Justice does not live on paper. It lives in you. Her words weren't lofty metaphors or polished slogans. They were direct, stripped raw of ornament, the kind of sentences that people remember not because they are pretty, but because they are undeniable. The silence grew heavier, yet beyond the chamber walls it was already breaking apart. In the hallways outside, aides stood frozen with phones pressed to their ears, relaying her words to unseen editors and producers. In newsrooms across the country, the speech crawled across screens and red banners. In neighborhoods where children sat cross-legged in front of televisions, her voice carried into their bones. Inside the chamber, however, it landed like a blow. Lawmakers who had voted yes shifted uneasily, realizing that her words offered no comfort to them. They were not praise. They were a demand that their vote be only the beginning, not the end. Her voice grew sharper, her eyes unblinking. Don't wait for Congress to fix what lives in our neighborhoods, in our schools, in our streets. Don't wait for leaders to hand you dignity. Claim it, defend it, build it. The repetition struck like hammer blows, each phrase falling harder than the last. The rhetoric wasn't polished, it was purposeful, stripped to the muscle. She was not asking, she was charging the people with responsibility, refusing to let anyone sit back and believe that a slim vote margin could fix centuries of pain. Every line dared the audience beyond those walls to see themselves not as spectators, but as soldiers in a fight they could not afford to abandon. Jasmine's eyes flicked to the lawmakers before her, to the men and women whose faces betrayed unease. She wasn't looking at them for approval, she was holding them accountable. We passed a law, but laws without people are empty. You want change? Then stand up when it's inconvenient. Speak when your voice shakes. Protect each other when the cameras aren't watching. That's the only way this survives. Her cadence was relentless, deliberate, and merciless. The silence after each line was not passive. It was heavy with the knowledge that she was right, and everyone in that chamber knew it. You could almost hear the heartbeat of the nation through the walls, pounding in sync with her sentences. Lawmakers who had hidden behind statistics and abstractions shifted in their seats. the weight of her truth pressing into them. Those who had voted no clenched their jaws, their faces tightening, as if the force of her words exposed them, not as protectors of order, but as obstacles to justice. Yet the hardest sting fell on the uncertain, the quiet ones, the ones who had whispered in corners but refused to stand openly until now. She had dragged them all into the light, and her message gave them nowhere to hide. Still, her voice did not rise into shouting. It sharpened instead, each syllable cutting deeper. Do not mistake a gavel strike for justice. Justice is the way you treat your neighbor when no one is watching. That single sentence was like a verdict handed down not by a court, but by the conscience of a nation. You could see lawmakers flinch. You could see aides glance nervously at each other. You could feel the press gallery leaning forward as if the room itself had tilted under the weight of the words. Justice was no longer a debate, it was a mirror, and she had forced every single person in that chamber, and every single viewer beyond it, to stare straight into it. The chamber sat motionless, but the silence was not still. It crackled, it hummed, it demanded. Her speech was not a celebration, it was a summons. Each line called not for applause, but for action, not for relief, but for responsibility. Outside, those words would ignite headlines, chants, protests, and conversations. Inside, it left the lawmakers exposed, trembling under the realization that they had been stripped of their excuses. The law might pass, but the hearts of the people would be the true battleground. And she had made it clear that history would remember not what was written on paper, but what was lived in practice. Jasmine's figure seemed taller in that moment, her shadow stretching across the chamber floor under the glare of the overhead lights. Her body language carried no triumph, only warning. She was telling them, telling everyone, that no law could outlive the silence of the people, and no statute could replace the courage of a neighbor choosing to act with humanity. The message pulsed with urgency, an urgency that dared to leave no one untouched. The lesson had been carved into the chamber moments earlier, but this was different. This was not just the lesson, it was the call. It was the demand that the people watching transform grief into vigilance, frustration into courage, silence into speech. It was not a plea. It was not advice. It was an order handed down not from authority, but from necessity. And the faces in the chamber, the voices outside, the millions at home knew in their bones that what she had said was not optional. It was survival. When she finally stepped back from the podium, she didn't smile, didn't bow, didn't seek applause. The silence remained thick, as though her words were still expanding, filling every crack in the marble, every shadow in the chamber. And though the cameras would soon cut away, though the papers would soon write their headlines, those who had heard her knew one thing with terrifying clarity. This was no victory speech. This was a warning shot, and it was aimed directly at the heart of a nation. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.